All right. I guess everybody's got a little thing to write the prayer requests. Yeah. Good. Well, we're starting in Ruth chapter 3. Ruth and Boaz at the threshing floor. So as always, we got a couple little questions to open up the chapter. The first one is, do you ever feel nervous when things seem to be going too well? It almost seems like when things are going like really, really well, it's like you know something's going to happen, right? Seems like, yeah. Or is that just me? All right. Okay. Are matchmakers generally effective? I heard a sure, it could be, and a sometimes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Through a matchmaker or through a computer? Oh, very cool. Okay. Is there a difference between a matchmaker and a busybody? Yeah, because sometimes a busybody is just someone who kind of, yeah, they butt in and they kind of, because some people might be single because they like to be single. You know, they don't want to necessarily hook up with anybody, and here you got the matchmaker, you know. Yeah, that's why I used it. Should the church be a resource for finding a spouse? Why or why not? You know, that's my thinking exactly. You know, think of all the bad places you could meet somebody, and church is no guarantee, but at least, yeah, it's kind of on the right track, yeah. So, you know, the way I look at it is if, you know, people meet one another, because, you know, you got widows and widowers and what have you, and, you know, divorcees and wannabes, and, you know, it just seems like there's a lot of lonely people out there, and if, you know, they, you know, come together and, you know, something happens, great. Praise the Lord, right? Yeah. What are the advantages or disadvantages to prearranged marriages? Right. So you could be fixed up with some really ugly guy with a big fat nose with a wart on the end, but maybe he's got a good heart though. You know, and then you know, then maybe he's this really, really great guy that you thought, wow, I never expected that guy to look so good, and then he turns out to be a creep. So you never know. And the same thing goes with the guy. You know, you could, you know, you meet the girl for the first time, and wow, wow. I don't know. I'm just trying to keep the conversation going. um, but she might be the one with the heart of gold. You know, that the guy's really looking for. So I mean, you really don't know, do you? Yeah. Okay. Um, and you know, we said some disadvantages, but what about the advantages? Well, you may not know who you're betrothed to. necessarily, you may or may not, they may live in a different town. Because if it was prearranged by your parents, maybe even before you were born. Yeah, it still goes, it's still that way today. Yeah. So, but what did you say, Art? You said something good. Yeah. All that dating and spending money, just, you know. Yeah. Yeah, because, it is a game, isn't it? When you're dating. Is it kind of like a game? And, you get tired of playing the game after the while. You just want to, you know. Or is it just me who sees it that way? I don't know. Nobody's cooperating with me tonight at all. I'll tell you. Yeah. Well, here's the deal. If you have a prearranged marriage, and let's say more or less you don't know the person, you're not going to love them when you get married. But as you get to know them and they get to know you, that love may develop and may be the best marriage you could have ever had. Yeah. It could, yeah. So, yeah. Is it good for men to go off and socialize with other men and for women to go off and socialize with other women? So you think having so many women together is a good idea? So you don't think that the women need maybe a man to chaperone them and I'm trying to get y'all to think a little bit outside the box. um, I'm just wondering. I mean, yeah, because maybe the men are going off and who knows what they're up to, right? They might be up to huh? They're fishing, yeah. That's the code word, by the way, fishing. Right? Yes. Yeah. Right. I go along with that, yeah. Yeah, because we don't care really that much. Years ago, I worked for the TCBY yogurt company, and one of the young ladies that worked there, she came, very attractive young lady, came up to me and she said, um, "Yeah, I just had my hair done, and all of the girls said how terrible it looks and how ugly I am, and they had nothing nice to say." And you know what she was trying to do, right? Yeah, she was trying to get me to respond, "Oh no, your hair looks great," and you look, yeah, and I looked at her and I said, "Oh yeah," because I knew what she was doing. I knew it, But anyway, is it appropriate for a woman to ask for a man's hand in marriage? Shelley, tell everybody about how you got it down on one knee and asked me to marry you. But you don't see nothing wrong with it. Yeah. They don't even ask each other anyway. They just, yeah. Okay. Well, Naomi instructs Ruth. So Ruth chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. It says, "One day Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, 'My daughter, should I not try to find a home for you where you will be well provided for? Is not Boaz with those servant girls you have been, a kinsman of ours? Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash and perfume yourself and put on your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do.' 'I will do whatever you say,' Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do." Do you think it's a good idea to do everything your mother-in-law tells you to do? Okay. Well, while the book of Ruth is about Ruth, chapter 3, verses 1 through 6 is all about Naomi. Okay, she's got the plan, right? As the days went by, Ruth was gleaning the fields with the servant girls while Naomi was staying in Bethlehem alone, which gave her plenty of time to prayerfully think. Naomi felt obligated to make sure that Ruth was well provided for, and she believed that Boaz was perhaps interested in her. Naomi's desire to find Ruth a home where she will be well provided for implies the provision and rest and security that can only be found in a marriage relationship. You know, it's not like they're going to dig up a chest full of gold or something, so yes. Exactly. Yeah, and maybe she knew a little, maybe she didn't. I mean, we don't know what she knew, because she had been living with Naomi for a while now, and I'm sure that, they talked about each other's customs and things like that. But yeah, I think you're right. Now, this was a culture, and still is, when parents arranged the marriage of their children. But the problem was that Boaz was not the nearest of kin. Therefore, Boaz really didn't have a legal obligation to get involved. So how does man's free will and God's sovereignty work together? Ever wonder about that? I'm going to give you a formula here in a little while, and that'll, I think, kind of explain it. But yeah. Naomi came up with a plan for Ruth to possibly attain Boaz, but if Boaz was to be their kinsman redeemer, it would still be by the grace and mercy of God. They can do all the planning they want and all the praying they want, and when it's all said and done, it's either going to happen or it's not going to happen, right? I think that's kind of the bottom line. Remember that Naomi believed that God was punishing her, so was it wise for her to play matchmaker? I mean, golly, if I thought God is punishing my mother-in-law, I certainly wouldn't maybe want to listen to her. I don't think Ruth thought that God was punishing Naomi, even though that's what Naomi thought. Remember, she wanted to be called Mara, which means bitter, right? So the 5 P's of decision making, okay? This is Pastor Herb now, okay? First of all, remember, when you make a decision, you need to pray. And you need to pray and continue to pray throughout the process. A lot of people say, well, I prayed. Well, yeah, how much did you pray, though? It's just like, should you pray at the beginning of the day? Yeah? Should you pray at the end of the day? And you should really pray everywhere in between, right? Even if it's little sentence prayers. You're doing some work and you got to lift something up. Lord, help me. It's a sentence prayer. Your neighbor comes over and tells you their problem. Well, God bless you. maybe, little sentence prayers, But Paul tells us to be God conscious at all times. And I think part of that, being conscious of God's presence, is being able to pray instantly. If you're thinking something bad, or doing something bad, or speaking something bad, you're not going to pray instantly, are you? But if you're, if you discipline yourself to try to be as godly as you can, you're going to start praying more, throughout the day. We've talked a lot about prayer. I don't want to get into like a big topic of prayer right now, but we've talked a lot about that in the past. But remember, prayer is an ongoing process. Any relationship you have, whether it's with a husband or a spouse or parents and children or employee or employer, every relationship, part of that is communication. And so when we pray to God, that's talking to God, right? And because the Holy Spirit is living in us, when we read His Word, God is speaking to us. And God speaks to us in many different ways. He might speak to you through a friend. He might speak to you in some other way. But if you don't pray, then God's not going to answer. And if God doesn't answer, then really there's no relationship, is there? So again, prayer is just so vitally important. Number 2 is plan. Develop a plan which prioritizes the steps that are required for reaching your goal. Very often when I'm counseling people, and it could be any topic whatsoever, it could be a death in the family, could be anything. I'll say to them, well, what's your plan? And I'm so surprised when people say they don't have one. Well, no wonder you're depressed. No wonder you're here for counseling. You don't even have a plan, right? You need to have a plan. And sometimes your plan and God's plan may not be the same. Sometimes we want something so bad that we think it's of God and it's really not. But I really believe that God is a God of order, and so He wants us to pray, and He wants us to plan. Sometimes it's hard to plan, though, isn't it? Sometimes you're in that situation in life, and you don't even know which direction to go to. How can you make a plan? Well, somebody told me this one time, and I think it was one of the best pieces of advice I ever got. They said that people are like sailing ships. And they said if your sail is down, God can turn that rudder any direction, but the boat's not going to go anywhere. You have to have the sail up, and you've got to move forward. And if you're moving forward, then God can steer you. And so that's always my mentality is, hey, you got to move forward. You got to move forward. And God does steer, right? So you got to have a plan. And sometimes when you're trying to develop a plan, and it's hard to do, sometimes you need to try to prepare. Sometimes you can only really do a plan at the same time you're preparing, because part of planning is understanding logistics. Same thing in warfare. The best generals in history had a very strong command of logistics. How can I get so many men in the field? They need so many weapons. They need so much ammunition. They need so many replacements. What about backups? What about more fuel supply to move them from point A to point B? I mean, there's so much logistically involved, and it's the same thing. How do you make a plan without logistics? So sometimes you got to kind of prepare and plan. Sometimes that goes together. And while you're preparing and planning, do you give up praying? No. And what you're going to find that if you change your goal, you'll never reach it. But sometimes you will have to change your plan to reach the goal, okay? Because God's going to move you this way, and then he's going to move you this way, and then he might move you over here. And so it's an ongoing process. And then pursue, right? This is where most people fail because they don't pursue because they're afraid of failure. You know, they've done all this praying and all this planning and preparing, but then they never go for the gold ring. And, you know, I don't care how many classes you take in evangelism. If you don't actually go out there and share your faith with somebody, then you haven't shared your faith with anybody, you know. And you don't have to be afraid of failure, do you? If somebody don't like me because I love Jesus, then I don't want them anyway as a friend, right? I mean, just to be honest with you, you know, and they're not rejecting me anywhere. They're rejecting Christ, you know. All I know is that as a Christian, my job is to share the gospel. And I have to do that in a loving way, don't I? A loving way, and be humble. And hopefully they'll receive it, and maybe they won't receive it, right? But that's in God's hands. But don't fail because you didn't pursue. And then while all that's still going on, well, then you've got God's providence, right? Again, God is a God of order. He honors your work. And if it's God's will, he will bless it. And if it's not God's will, then it's not going to happen. What will it? God opens doors and he closes doors. Now, sometimes we want something so bad, we think it's of God, and then we're wondering, well, why is he not opening the door? And then we try to maybe go to that door and we try to kick it in. Let's kick that door open, okay? And if you try to do that, usually it doesn't turn out very well. Going back to evangelism, evangelism is like picking fruit. If the fruit's green, it's not going to pull off the tree, is it? You got to really rip it off, and then you didn't do the tree any good, and you didn't do the fruit any good, okay? But if it's ripe and ready, all you got to do is lightly work it, and the fruit will come right off in your hand, okay? And so that's the way we need to deal with certain things, you know. Life isn't always easy, but we need to be faithful. We need to be obedient. We need to be humble. So those are my 5 P's, right? 5 P's. And then I also have what I call my 4 landmarks in decision making. 4 landmarks in decision making. The first landmark is ask yourself, is it biblical? Is it biblical? I think I mentioned this already in the past, but God commanded the Israelites to go to some particular village or city and kill every man, every woman, every child, every beast, annihilate them completely. But that doesn't mean that he's wanting us to go now to Winter Haven and do the same thing, right? So, again, you have to ask yourself, is this biblical for me? Is this applying to my life? You'll find that whatever situation that you're in your life, you'll find it in the Bible. I believe in the complete sufficiency of the Bible for everything in your life. I really believe that. Number 2, seek godly qualified counsel. Seek godly qualified counsel. If you want to sell your house, you should talk to a realtor. You know, you don't want to talk to Joe Blow down the road down there. He doesn't know nothing about it, right? But you want to talk to somebody who's qualified, maybe, you know, a realtor. But you want to also maybe go to someone that's also godly, you know, that's going to have discernment. You can be qualified but ungodly. You can also be godly but unqualified. And I think both go together, wouldn't you say? Same thing with politicians, right? You know, I mean, you want qualified people. I'm happy if they're godly, but maybe they don't know what they're doing. you know? So you want someone who can do both, qualified and godly. Number 3, analyze the circumstances. Analyze the circumstances. I believe that God is in control. Like I said, he opens doors, he closes doors. But he also permits Satan to do stuff as well. So you really have to be able to look at what's going on around you in your situation. Remember what Paul said, to walk circumspectly? You know what that means? That means that as you're walking, you're going to constantly know what's going on around you. If I do this too much, I'll get dizzy. But when you're walking, constantly look around you and know what's going on. That's what it means to walk circumspectly, okay? And if you don't know what's going on, how are you going to make a good decision? So look at your circumstances. And number 4, Holy Spirit conviction. Is God giving me a good conviction or feeling about this decision? Or is he giving me a bad conviction or feeling about this decision? Usually if we do something wrong, don't we feel it? Yeah. Whether it's guilt or something, there's something wrong, and that's the Holy Spirit within you working in your conscience. So if you'll consider the 5 P's of decision making and the 4 landmarks of decision making, put that together, you're most likely going to make the right decisions. Amen? It was customary for a landowner and his men to spend the night upon the threshing floor, because once the grain is winnowed, it is at its premium value prior to being bagged and transported to the mill. Naomi knew that Boaz would be there to protect his investment. So, hey, there's a lot of money up there, and boy, thieves could come and take all that grain away, couldn't they? So they would spend the night up there, and they would guard that grain until it was, hauled away. The evening provided cool breezes, which was for winnowing, and it provided the men an opportunity to eat and drink and socialize with one another. Harvest was always associated with festivals and celebration. So this was not just at this winnowing floor, but really winnowing floors all across the land. They were doing harvests and celebrating and partying and having a good time. Naomi essentially tells Ruth to prepare herself like a bride. And I've got cross-references there if you're taking notes. She was to bathe. That's a good idea, to bathe. Body odor is not cool. And I can remember being in business many times, I had to pull someone to the side and tell them they had to bathe. I had to be the bad guy, tell them to wash their clothes, because nobody wants to smell it, And she was out in the field working all day, right? So it tells her to bathe, put on some perfume, and put on her best outfit, okay? Ruth was not to make her presence known, and she was to note where Boaz was lying down. He probably slept on a mat or skin at the base of the far side of the barley heap. So here you got this big heap of barley, and on one side maybe are the workers, and Boaz, being the boss man, would have probably been on the other side. So he had a little bit of a seclusion there. Why would it be important for Ruth to note where he lay down? I realize that's common sense, but, golly, think about how horrible everything would have turned out. Yeah, it was dark, pitch black. Who are you? Wait a minute, who are you? It's a big deal, right? Naomi goes on to tell her after he had eaten and fallen asleep, she was to uncover Boaz's feet and lie down at the foot of his bed and await a response. Now this is the most controversial part of the book, And I don't want to challenge you even to look at what other people have to say about it. A lot of liberal scholars have really maligned Ruth, said some horrible, horrible things. And the thing is, if these scholars were really educated, they wouldn't say what they're saying. Sometimes I wonder, are they getting paid off to say this? Is it just to sell books, or what's the deal here, you know? I'll tell you a little bit of it, but I'm not even going to tell you most of it. Liberal scholars have tried to make this a controversial text by labeling it as sex sells. They accuse Naomi of pimping out her daughter-in-law to survive. Their version of the text explains that Ruth was to make herself look hot and then to crawl into Boaz's bed when he was passed out drunk. Then she was to uncover him, leaving him half naked. Then when he awoke to find a young, beautiful woman in his bed, she was to obey his instructions. These liberal scholars say that the feet are a euphemism for the genitalia, and to uncover is a euphemism for sexual activity. And they quote a lot of different texts, that they get that out of. But here's the deal: if you look those texts up, and I did, most of what those texts are talking about is not what they're talking about. Maybe a little in some ways, but for the most part, that's not what it's talking about. Just taking things completely out of context and making it say something that it doesn't say, okay? And what really doesn't help is that this is not a new phenomenon. Obviously, artists have been doing this for quite a long time. Here's one picture where Boaz has Ruth over his shoulder. That's Ruth 2 gleaning. Now, I don't think Ruth looked like that gleaning. That's another one of Ruth. And then there's that one, and it's like, I'm sure she was a very beautiful woman. I have no doubt of that. But they're reading something into the text that was not there, okay? Ruth's tender plea was made within the integrity of her culture. These liberal scholars also paint Boaz as a guy who shirked his responsibility and now felt pressured and shamed to fulfill his legal obligation to be kinsman redeemer. These pseudo-scholars essentially teach that Naomi was a pimp, Ruth was a slut seeking interracial relations, and Boaz was a deadbeat. And there's a lot more garbage that's not worth repeating, but those who interpret sexual events are reflecting our modern culture of sexual promiscuity. It's our culture that does that stuff, and there's no way that you can compare our culture with a culture on the other side of the earth 4,000 years ago. I mean, it just doesn't click. The truth is that Naomi's advice was in keeping with their culture of that time. She loved Ruth and would never have asked her to commit an act of immorality. Ruth was loyal, obedient, and did nothing inappropriate. Boaz was not legally obligated, nor would he have been so forward as to pursue Ruth until all the other kinsman redeemers would have been eliminated for some reason. Maybe they were too old, maybe they were too poor, maybe they were too sick, I don't know. But until the other people that were closer relatives to her, Naomi's husband, until they were eliminated, it would have been inappropriate for Boaz to pursue Ruth. Does that make sense? Okay. Ruth had no doubt, and Boaz was probably old enough to be her father. Why would he dishonor a woman that he's choosing to marry? That wouldn't make any sense, does it? premarital sex was a cultural taboo and would have destroyed both their reputations. Beloved, the writers of the Bible don't pull any punches when they document sexual relations. You know, right from the very beginning, Adam knew Eve and she begot Cain and Abel. I mean, that's pretty cut and dry. You know, when David cheated and had relations with Bathsheba, it's pretty cut and dry. Very rarely in the Bible is there a gray area. There may be some gray areas, but very, very, very few. And usually it has to do just with euphemisms that they used back then. But again, if there was sexual relations would have taken place, it would have been a lot more clear that took place. Some elderly men today are aggressively overt as they drive around in their sport convertibles while their flopovers wave in the breeze. Trying to find a good flopover picture, but, you know. In Boaz's day, he couldn't have asked her out for coffee or for dinner or for a movie because that's not the way they did stuff back then. You know, completely different culture. Therefore, Ruth had to initiate her proposal, and Boaz had the choice to say yes or no. So this was a wedding proposal. That's what it was. Therefore, while Naomi's advice to Ruth may appear strange to us, if it would have appeared evil to them, Naomi would not have advised it. By the way, that's a threshing floor. That's an example of one. To think otherwise is completely contrary to what we know about Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. I mean, this whole book has been about how wonderful Ruth was and how loyal she was to her mother-in-law. And the loving relationship she had with her, and it's such a good book. Now, why would it turn dark all of a sudden? It doesn't make any sense. Do y'all remember, is it Proverbs 31, the virtuous woman? A lot of people believe that was written, I'm just pulling this out of my head now, that was written by Solomon about his great-great-grandmother, Ruth. So they believe she was this great woman. So again, is it the great-great-grand? Either way, you know what I'm saying. Ruth was proselytized to Judaism, and so it was within her rights, according to the law and culture, to make a legal claim upon Boaz. That's Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10. And not only is it biblical, the biblical law, the Levirate law, it was also the law of the land. Because remember, the law of the land is not always the same as the law of God, yeah. Yeah, back in those days, and actually way before, it started really with Abraham, you have what's called the, let's see if my brain can remember now. I think it's called the Newsy laws, the Newsy. And that was laws of the land, which are strikingly parallel in many ways to the Ten Commandments. And then later Babylon came up with the Code of Hammurabi. You've heard of that. Those were also the laws of the land. And so they had an obligation to obey God's law and the laws of the land. Now, of course, God's law supersedes the laws of the land, obviously. But both laws gave her the legal claim to propose to Boaz. Remember that this is an Old Testament historical description, and so it provides principles, not precepts, for the issues of Christian life and faith for today. So while we're not now to go to the person and uncover their feet and lay there, and you know that doesn't apply to us today, there is still a principle involved of right and wrong that we do apply to our lives today. Therefore, we cannot judge them based upon our modern culture or by today's standards. Tamar, the mother of Perez, also laid claim to the kinsman redeemer provision of the Levirate law. So it's not a new thing, is it? It's been there. It's been going on. It's part of the deal. Okay, Ruth 3, beginning in verse 7. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man, and he turned and discovered a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer." "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All my fellow townsmen know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am near of kin, there is a kinsman redeemer nearer than I. Stay here for tonight, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem, good, let him redeem. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning." So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, "Don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor." He also said, "Bring me the shawl you are wearing and hold it out." When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then he went back to town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her, and added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." Okay? So people back then often slept in the same clothes that they wore during the day. And especially if you're a bunch of guys out on, working out on the threshing floor, you're partying a little bit, it's late, you're going to have the same clothes on as you did before. And it was also normal for masters and servants to sleep together using a common blanket. Ruth would have gently uncovered his feet, either his blanket or the skirt of his robe, and laid down. Boaz's cold feet probably woke him up around midnight, and he was startled to find a woman laying at the foot of his bed. I would be too. I'd say, "Shelley, who's that?" Ruth identified herself and made a request for marriage. In other words, to be under his wing. By spreading his cloak and or blanket over her, it signified that he would marry her. Today, many modern Jewish and Hindu ceremonies still include the ritual of the groom placing a silk or cotton cloak around his bride. In verse 15, the reference to Ruth's veil or shawl was a large sheet of cloth. Wealthy women often wore red silk. Common women often wore them in blue. Okay? It was a big sheet of cloth that they had, and so he filled it full of grain for her. Of course, you read the liberal commentaries, they're going to tell you that he was paying her off for a good night. Okay. They wrapped the veil around their head in order to conceal their whole face except for one eye. Just as even today brides wear veils and the groom uncovers the face of his bride to ensure that he's marrying the right woman. Verse 10, Boaz rewards Ruth because he's grateful for her offer. After all, she could have pursued a younger man, couldn't she? She was young. And it's very unlikely that Boaz had been single the whole time. Probably his wife had died. Verse 18, Boaz needed to follow protocol because his and Ruth's integrity were on the line. So she's doing everything just right, and now he's got to follow up and do everything just right. As we'll see in the next chapter, Boaz must first wait to see if the closer kinsman will fulfill his duty. And if not, then he would be honored to do so. Boaz preserved her reputation by having her stay until morning rather than leaving during the night. Just imagine if the woman's leaving at night, it looks worse, right? And he seems to be instructed. Maybe I messed that up. It seems that he's instructing his workers. It's a little bit confusing in the text. His workers that they don't tell anyone that a woman was on the threshing floor during the evening. Okay? Because it reads like he's telling Ruth, don't tell anyone. But I think he's telling his workers. In verse 15, Boaz gave Ruth 6 ephahs of barley so she might not go home empty-handed to her mother-in-law. The significance of this gift is uncertain. Yet it could be a bridal price. It could be a message asking for Naomi's consent. Because she was part of it, right? And this never would have happened without her. And it could be a cover story so people would assume that Ruth was out gleaning. Either way, this was a gift from a man for the woman he hoped to marry. Remember, women are always expensive.